December 20th, 1943, over Germany. A Luftwaffe fighter pilot pulls his Messerschmitt Bf-109 alongside a crippled American B-17 bomber. The American crew can see him through their shattered windows. He can see them, wounded, desperate, struggling to stay airborne. One burst from his guns would finish them. His finger rests on the trigger. He's already shot down multiple aircraft. One more kill would earn him the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military honour. Instead, Franz Stigler made a decision that should have gotten him executed. He chose to save them. Franz Stigler wasn't a reluctant warrior or a secret pacifist. He was a professional fighter pilot and a skilled one. Born in 1915 in Bavaria, Stigler grew up around aircraft. His father and uncle were World War I pilots. Flying was in his blood. By the time World War II started, he'd already logged thousands of hours as a civilian pilot and flight instructor. He joined the Luftwaffe in 1940 and was assigned to fighter training. His instructors included some of Germany's best aces. One of them was Gustav Rödel, an officer who taught Stigler not just how to fight, but how to fight with honour. By December 1943, Stigler had proven himself in combat. He'd flown missions in North Africa, Sicily and Italy before being transferred to defend Germany itself. He'd been shot down multiple times and survived. He'd scored 22 confirmed kills against Allied aircraft. He was 28 years old, experienced, and exactly the kind of pilot the Luftwaffe desperately needed as American bombers began hammering German cities. But he was also a pilot who remembered what Gustav Rödel had told him. You follow the rules of war for you, not your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity. On the morning of December 20th, 1943, the US 8th Air Force launched a bombing raid against aircraft factories in Bremen, Germany. The B-17 bomber Ye Old Pub was part of that raid, piloted by 21-year-old Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown on his first combat mission as pilot. The mission went wrong immediately. German fighters hit the formation hard. Ye Olde Pub took multiple cannon hits. The No. 2 engine was destroyed. The No. 4 engine was damaged and leaking oil. The electrical system was failing. The oxygen system was shot out, causing the crew to suffer from hypoxia at high altitude. Then it got worse. The tail gunner, Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, was killed instantly by cannon fire. Multiple crew members were wounded. The bomber's nose was shattered. The tail section was so damaged that the rear gunner's position was nearly blown off. Holes large enough to crawl through punctured the fuselage. Charlie Brown managed to drop their bombs and turn toward England, but Ye Old Pub had fallen out of formation. In the air war over Germany, a lone bomber was a dead bomber. German fighters swarmed isolated aircraft. The B-17 limped along at barely 2,000 feet, far below normal altitude, desperately trying to reach the North Sea in safety. The crew knew more fighters would come. They had almost no ammunition left. Several of the defensive guns were destroyed. They were defenceless. Franz Stigler had just landed at Yevor Airfield to refuel and rearm after an earlier engagement. He was sitting in his cockpit when ground crew shouted and pointed. A B-17 was flying right past the airfield at extremely low altitude. Easy prey. Stigler took off immediately. This would be simple. The bomber was crippled, alone, flying low and slow. His Bf-109 was faster, more manoeuvrable and fully armed. He closed in from behind, moving into attack position. He needed just one more confirmed kill for the Knight's Cross. This would be it. Stigler pulled alongside the bomber to verify it was American and choose his point of attack. Standard procedure. Get a good look, then shoot. But what he saw stopped him. Through the massive holes in the fuselage, Stigler could see inside the bomber. He could see the crew. The tail gunner was clearly dead, slumped in his position. Other crew members were wounded, bloodied, struggling to perform their duties. The tail section was so badly damaged he couldn't understand how it was still attached. The entire aircraft looked like it had been through a shredder. Stigler looked into the cockpit. He could see Charlie Brown fighting to control the aircraft. The young pilot looked back at him. Their eyes met, and Franz Stigler thought about Gustav Rödel's words. What he was looking at wasn't an enemy bomber anymore. It was a flying coffin full of dying men. Shooting them down would be murder, not combat. German military honour drilled into him by Rödel had a rule. You don't shoot a parachute. You don't shoot a man in a parachute because he's defenceless, no longer a threat, and entitled to the chance of survival. These men were no different. They were as defenceless as someone hanging from a parachute. The bomber could barely fly. It couldn't fight back. Franz Stigler made his decision. Stigler pulled his fighter into formation alongside the B-17. He flew on their wing, close enough that the American crew could clearly see him. Inside Ye Olde Pub, the crew panicked. A German fighter right next to them. They waited for the guns to fire. Some crew members tried to man the damaged guns, but they had almost no ammunition, and the guns barely worked. Stigler waved at them. He pointed down toward Germany, indicating they should land. The Americans refused. They kept flying toward England. Stigler stayed with them. He understood their choice. Landing in Germany meant becoming prisoners of war. They'd rather take their chances trying to reach home. What Stigler did next was even more extraordinary. He moved his fighter into a protective position. He flew slightly ahead and to the side of the bomber, clearly visible to anyone watching from the ground. His presence served a purpose. German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground and on ships in the coastal waters were trained to fire on any Allied aircraft. But with a German fighter flying in close formation with the bomber, the gunners couldn't tell if it was a captured aircraft being escorted in or some kind of training exercise. They held their fire. Stigler was using his fighter to shield the American bomber from his own forces. They flew this way for several minutes, crossing the German coast toward the North Sea. Stigler knew that every second he stayed with them was another second he risked being seen by his superiors, another second someone might report what he was doing. If anyone in the Luftwaffe found out he'd deliberately let an enemy bomber escape, worse, actively helped it escape, he'd face a court-martial. The penalty was execution. Over the North Sea, at the limit of how far he could escort them, Stigler pulled in close one more time. He looked at Charlie Brown in the cockpit. He gave a salute, a formal military salute, one pilot to another. Then he broke formation, turned back toward Germany, and flew away. Charlie Brown and his crew watched the German fighter disappear. They couldn't understand what had just happened. An enemy pilot had just saved their lives. The old pub continued across the North Sea. The damaged bomber made it to England, barely, landing at an emergency airfield on the British coast. When the ground crew saw the damage, they couldn't believe the aircraft had stayed in the air. The bomber was so badly damaged it never flew again. It was scrapped for parts. All surviving crew members made it home. Franz Stigler returned to base. He never reported the encounter. He never told anyone in the Luftwaffe what he'd done. It was too dangerous. Helping an enemy bomber escape wasn't mercy. It was treason under German military law. He continued flying combat missions until the end of the war. He survived the war, surrendered to American forces, and eventually emigrated to Canada in 1953, where he became a successful businessman. Charlie Brown also survived the war. He returned to the United States, eventually became a diplomat, and lived a quiet life. But neither man could forget what happened that day over Germany. Charlie Brown carried the memory of the German pilot who had saved his life. He told his crew never to speak about it. If the US military found out they'd been spared by an enemy pilot, there might be uncomfortable questions about why. So they stayed silent. Franz Stigler carried the memory too. He'd violated orders and risked execution to save enemy lives. He couldn't talk about it either. For more than 40 years, both men kept the secret. In 1986, Charlie Brown decided to try to find the German pilot. He published a notice in a Combat Pilot Association newsletter, describing the encounter and asking if anyone knew who the Luftwaffe pilot might have been. The notice reached Franz Stigler in Canada. In 1990, they met for the first time since that day in 1943. Charlie Brown was 68 years old. Franz Stigler was 75. They recognized each other immediately. Franz confirmed every detail of Charlie's story. He explained his decision, the code of honor, the memory of Gustav Rödel's teaching, the sight of the wounded crew. He'd carried guilt for 47 years, not for sparing them, but for all the other aircraft he'd shot down. The Americans he'd saved reminded him that his enemies were human beings, not just targets. The two men became close friends. They spent their remaining years together, appearing at air shows, telling their story and corresponding regularly. They spoke on the phone every week. Franz Stigler died in 2008 at the age of 92. Charlie Brown died 8 months later at age 87. They're buried not far from each other. Before his death, Franz told interviewers that sparing Charlie Brown's crew was the best thing he'd ever done. Charlie Brown said Franz was like a brother to him. Franz Stigler's decision on December 20th, 1943 wasn't about politics or ideology. It was about something simpler and more fundamental. the recognition of shared humanity even in the middle of total war. He risked execution to spare 10 men he'd never met and would never see again. He gained nothing from it. In fact, it cost him. He never got his Knight's Cross, never got the recognition German military culture valued. But he kept his humanity. He followed the code of honour he'd been taught, even when it contradicted his orders and endangered his life. The story also reveals something about the culture of fighter pilots in World War II. Despite fighting on opposite sides, despite the propaganda and hatred of the war, many pilots maintained a code of conduct rooted in mutual respect. They saw themselves as warriors, not murderers. There were rules, unwritten but understood. Franz and Charlie's friendship after the war showed that the humanity they recognized in each other that day in 1943 was real and lasting. Their enemies weren't the people in the other aircraft. Their enemies were the circumstances that put them there. What Franz Stigler did that day was simple. He looked at his enemy and saw human beings in trouble. He chose mercy over duty, and that choice defined the rest of both their lives.